Hello and welcome to the Drug Cultures Podcast. I'm your host, Sky Hawthorne. All content is produced by yours truly. All opinions are mine, unless of course you disagree with them, in which case I'm sorry, I didn't mean it. At Drug Cultures, my goal is to shine a light on the cultural uses of psychoactive substances, as well as the unique history and politics of this infinitely complicated and oftentimes very taboo topic. Today we're going to be talking about Kratom. Now, the story of Kratom is one that will sound dramatically different depending on who is doing the telling. In the United States, outside of the relatively few states and cities in which it's banned, products derived from the leaves of the Kratom tree, also known as Mitragyna speciosa, can be found just about everywhere, from gas stations to smoke shops to supplement stores, and even sometimes at bars that might serve herbal beverages for people who want to avoid alcohol. The leaves from Mitragyna speciosa contain a number of psychoactive alkaloids, most prominently mitragynine and 7-hydroxymitragynine, but there are dozens of these compounds, more than have been adequately studied in a lab, and this very complicated pharmacology gives Kratom a very unique effect profile. At lower doses, it exerts a mildly stimulating effect in most users, providing a couple hours of increased sociability, extroversion, energy, and focus, though effects can vary from user to user. At higher doses, its effects are more like those of a classic opioid, such as codeine. They can trigger sensations like sedation, euphoria, pain relief. The drug is absolutely habit-forming when taken regularly at any dose and can be quite addictive at higher doses, though it has a tremendous advantage over classical opioids in that at the doses usually taken in its pure form, Kratom's alkaloids are incapable of causing respiratory depression, which means that basically it cannot cause a lethal overdose unless combined with other more dangerous drugs. This has made it a godsend for many people struggling with opioid addiction, who are able to use Kratom at a lower cost than maintenance medications such as Suboxone, and with none of the risky side effects of street drugs like heroin, which have increasingly become contaminated with the incredibly deadly synthetic opioid fentanyl and its analogs. Kratom's story here in the United States has been told quite extensively, including on other drug podcasts, which I highly recommend you listen to if you haven't already. In 2016, the DEA announced its intent to classify Kratom as a Schedule I drug, the same category as heroin, which would have made it impossible for people to purchase legally. The community of Kratom users, many of whom were desperate to maintain access to a pain management tool or afraid of backsliding into hard drug use, organized demonstrations and lobbied in DC, and within 2 months the DEA changed its mind. It's a very inspiring story, actually, and it's worth an episode in and of itself. But, for the purposes of this episode, I'd like to focus on Thailand, which has a much more ancient history of Kratom use and of Kratom prohibition. Its use was prohibited starting in 1943, and only in 2021 was it decriminalized. That decriminalization actually may have been related to the US's decision not to schedule Kratom. Smaller countries often take their cue from the United States when it comes to drug policy-related decisions. So when the US decides not to go forward with a ban, Kratom isn't categorized as a narcotic in the UN Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs, and so the Thai government feels it won't be punished for decriminalizing the plant domestically. But why was Kratom prohibited in Thailand in the first place? Kratom trees have likely grown in Thailand since before humans were there to harvest them, and traditional use dates back to the 1600s or earlier, especially among men. Kratom leaves were often chewed by field workers for increased energy. Kratom tea was often used as a treatment for stomach ache, diarrhea, and wouldn't you know it, opium withdrawal. And it's actually that last use, its role as an opium alternative, that first led to the Kratom Act, which banned its use in Thailand. At the time, Thailand was allied with the Axis powers in World War II, having surrendered to Japan under threat of invasion in 1941. In the first few decades of the 20th century, the Thai government had made a sizable portion of its revenue from taxation of opium products, but by the 1940s, revenues were on the decline and kratom was seen as part of the problem. In a January 1943 special meeting of the Thai House of Representatives, Police Major General Pin Amonwisai Soradej, I am totally butchering that name, complained, and I quote, "Taxes for opium are high, while kratom is currently not being taxed. With the increase of those taxes, people are starting to use kratom instead, and this has had a visible impact on our government's income." In many ways, this is sort of a funhouse mirror version of what happened here in the States, except our DEA was ostensibly concerned that kratom would lead people into opioid use, while the Axis-aligned Thai government was concerned that kratom use would stop people from buying imported opium and thus cut into their war coffers. Of course, some people might say that something similar is happening here in the States in terms of pharma companies wanting to protect their profit margins, but I'm not going to dive into such theories. Now, after the war, Thailand suffered almost no consequences from the international community for fighting alongside the Axis powers, given that most countries saw Japan as responsible for Thailand's involvement in the war. However, its 1943 Kratom Act remained on the books, though it was rarely enforced, a political relic of wartime. In 1979, Thailand passed its Narcotics Act, which placed kratom into Category 5, a categorization which not only prohibited its use, but also required kratom trees to be cut down. Still, this categorization was rarely enforced, and up until the turn of the century, Thai citizens were usually able to grow kratom or harvest wild kratom with minimal risk of state persecution. All this changed in the early 2000s when the Prime Minister at the time, Thaksin Shinawatra, launched a brutal war on drugs that, for political reasons, was especially brutal in the southern provinces of Thailand, where kratom is most often grown and used. The fact that drug use of some sort is commonplace in almost every culture is part of why drug prohibition has existed around the world as well. When drug use is culturally bound, or when an ethnic or nationalist or political faction can be associated with that drug use, this drug use can be scapegoated to great effect. And this public perception, the perception that these drugs and the people who use them are dangerous, can be manipulated to justify military violence, government surveillance, and economic oppression. In the case of Thailand, it had dealt for decades with a Malay ethno-nationalist movement in its southernmost provinces. While Thailand is almost entirely Buddhist, its Patani region, consisting of the provinces of Patani, Narathiwat, and Yala, and parts of Songkhla and Satun, is majority Muslim and ethnically Malay. Now, do these separatists want to join Malaysia? No. Loosely operating under the banner of a rebel group called BRN Coordinate, they seem mostly united in their hatred of the cultural effects of Thai rule, and have proposed little in the way of an alternative vision. Some militants within the movement have expressed nostalgia for the Sultanate of Patani, a kingdom that existed in the region until its 1902 annexation by Thailand, which at the time was known as Siam. Others advocate for the creation of an independent state called Patani Darussalam, or the Islamic land of Patani. These separatists see the erasure of their language and culture through education as one of the greatest evils to come from Thai occupation, and since the fighting broke out in 2004, they have been particularly brutal in their violence toward Thai Buddhist teachers, killing over 150 in the first 10 years of this insurgency. Their propaganda materials emphasize their Malay ethnic identity. They oftentimes are vitriolic in their hatred for any Thai Buddhist and extend that hatred to Muslims they see as collaborating with Thai Buddhists. Their attacks during this time have shown little regard for whether they hit military or civilian targets, and these militants have regularly used drive-by shootings and car bombings as tools of terrorism. So don't get it twisted when I say that the Thai government used anti-drug hysteria to justify a crackdown on the Malay community of southern Thailand. That does not mean I'm making a moral case for the insurgency. I have a principled stance against terrorism of any kind, including terrorism in service of a theocratic vision, which this absolutely seems to be. But Prime Minister Thaksin's war on drugs was just one aspect of its particularly brutal backlash to this insurgency. Just months after the first insurgent raid in 2004, Thai military opened fire on a crowd of protesters in the province of Patani, killing 7 immediately. They then proceeded to detain over 1,000 of these protesters, where they were loaded into military vans and transported to a camp 5 hours away. The protesters were packed so tightly in these vans that 78 of them died from suffocation on this journey. Is this not terrorism as well? Of course it is. The only difference is that it's perpetrated by a state actor and not a militant group. So, am I saying that the threat posed by this insurgency caused the Thai government to clamp down on drug use? Not exactly. Prime Minister Thaksin's government was already cracking down on drugs. In fact, when the insurgency started, it had been viciously targeting drug dealers and often drug users in response to rising use of a drug called yaba, which is basically methamphetamine mixed with caffeine in a pill. Nearly 3,000 people were assassinated in extrajudicial killings over a 3-month period in 2003, ostensibly for drug dealing, but testimonies from victims and their loved ones have said that many were simply drug users or even suspected users. And these people, the users who weren't killed, they were often forced into boot camp-style drug treatment programs, sort of a get clean or else situation. This war on drugs, make no mistake, was a terrible breach of human freedom. Whatever the risk that yaba posed, and I'm certainly not advocating in favor of methamphetamine, I don't advocate in favor of anybody doing any drug on this podcast, but whatever the risk of yaba, it certainly didn't outweigh the damage done by forcing drug users into hiding, discouraging them from seeing their doctor, and contributing to the spread of HIV in the country. Even as HIV rates rose, Thaksin's government refused to support needle exchange programs, even though they've been shown to work well at reducing HIV spread in other countries. And while Thaksin's war on drugs certainly shocked the international community, it did succeed in creating a precedent for the government to attack drug use when it is politically convenient. And that is exactly what they did in response to the Patani insurgency. Because remember how 80% of those 3 Patani provinces are Muslim, and the vast majority of Thailand's Muslims live in that relatively small region? Well, that's also the region with the highest density of Kratom users, and those two things aren't entirely unrelated. Practicing Muslims are forbidden from drinking alcohol, and many devout Muslims take this very seriously. Whether or not Kratom is haram, the Muslim term for forbidden, has been debated, and I'd love someday to do an episode on the relationship between Islam and drugs throughout its history, but the fact is there are a lot of Muslims in the Patani region who don't drink and do use Kratom, which used to grow abundantly in the area. And Thaksin's authoritarian crackdown on drug dealers provided a framework for cracking down on insurgents as well as the communities they live in. Remember how the 1979 categorization of Kratom under the Narcotics Act meant that all the currently existing Kratom trees had to be cut down? Well, this mandate was largely ignored until the start of the insurgency in 2004, and that's when the Thai government began a campaign of eradication, clear-cutting Kratom forests, some of which were home to a complicated and rare ecosystem. The eradication of southern Kratom forests was near total, and it forced the local population, 70% of whom had used Kratom at some point in their lives and 10% of whom used it regularly, to either become criminals themselves or to buy from criminal elements such as Malaysian drug smugglers. And amazingly, as I was doing my homework in preparation for this episode, I saw a number of articles and reports describing Thailand as a model of quote-unquote humane drug suppression efforts. And I honestly couldn't believe what I was reading. It's amazing how quickly state propaganda falls apart under the slightest bit of scrutiny. Because not only has Thailand gone to incredible lengths to destroy Kratom forests in its deep south, but it did the exact same thing to its opium-growing community starting in the 60s. The official phrase I keep seeing is that they suppressed drug crops humanely through alternative development, which implies that they just paid farmers to grow a different crop aside from opium, and managed to eliminate opium production entirely this way. But this is not at all the case. The Royal Thai Army was actually quite vicious with the opium-growing hill tribes, going as far as to set their villages on fire and plant landmines in their poppy fields. Poppies can only grow above about 3,000 feet in that climate, and the Thai government used landmines, to make sure that these villagers could never return to their homes, certainly never use their poppy fields ever again without risking their lives. An ethnographer named Doug Miles wrote the following about staying with the Yao people in the Northern Highlands until they were abruptly and forcibly removed from their homes in 1969. The exodus of Highlanders was largely affected by the immediate, subsequent intrusion into all bombed settlements by the Royal Thai Army, some of whose work parties set fire to dwellings and ransacked outhouses, while other units manually planted mines in the vicinity of those constructions and in all Swidens at or above the minimum altitude, 1,000 meters, required by the poppy crop. Any likelihood of even a temporary return by the Yao fugitives appeared to have been totally eliminated. Poppy growing in this area had been permanently terminated by denying the crop the human labor essential for its cultivation. So the Thai military didn't execute these systematic attacks on the hill tribes out of some newfound concern for opium addicts, or a desire to be a drug-free country as an end in and of itself. They did so because at the time, the Thai government was collaborating with the United States as it waged its war in Vietnam. And the hill tribes of northern Thailand, including the Yao, the Meo, and others, were removed enough from mainstream Thai society to be susceptible to the influence of communist agitators from Laos and from China. These communist insurgents, embedded among the hill tribes, carried out 17 political assassinations in the first half of the 1960s, and eventually started targeting Thai security forces directly. The Thai government couldn't respond by slaughtering these communities wholesale without provoking international backlash, but what they could do was attack their livelihood. The fear of narcotics production gave the Thai military cover to destroy cropland and drop napalm on villages. And make no mistake, the United States was absolutely complicit in this, as it's quite likely that without the US presence in Vietnam, the insurgency and the violent counterinsurgency would never have happened this way. So this is what Thailand does. When a threat to its existence emerges within its borders, it does whatever it can to extinguish that threat using whatever means, and drug suppression efforts consistently provide a palatable justification. When it comes to the ongoing Malay insurgency, and I say ongoing because sporadic attacks continue to this day, there's no evidence that they're connected to the drug trade at all. One study found only 2% overlap between those involved in criminal activity related to the insurgency and criminal activity related to drug trafficking. In fact, insurgent recruiters often demand that their recruits do not use drugs. But this has not stopped the media from using ignorance about drugs, including Kratom, to link it to the insurgency and justify eradication campaigns. And when people pushed back on the idea that Kratom was somehow associated with or responsible for insurgent violence, media outlets began reporting on a Kratom cocktail that young people were making called 4x100. 4x100 in its most simple form is just Kratom tea, cough syrup, Coca-Cola, and ice cubes. And most of the reports I've seen say that usually the cough syrup is not even the psychoactive kind, not the kind with codeine or with DXM. It's usually just added as a flavoring agent, aside from there being a mild sedative effect of the antihistamine. So really, 4x100 might as well just be Kratom sweet tea, because apparently the US isn't the only country where we drink sweet tea in the Deep South. But then you start hearing these reports of other substances being added to the cocktail, substances like meth or benzos like Xanax and Klonopin, and the reports don't stop there. Purported additives to the 4x100 cocktail include mosquito coils, ground-up light bulb filaments, and bird shit. One 2013 article in The Atlantic went so far as to claim that Patani militants were lacing their 4x100 with the ash of a corpse. Now, in fairness to the author of the piece, he wasn't actually the first to make this claim, but absolutely nothing in this article should have made it to print in a publication as ostensibly serious as The Atlantic. Like, this article is the perfect example of the most incredibly lazy journalism that can end up getting published when people have absolutely no education about drugs. So let's read a little bit of this thing, just for fun. The article is by Jonah Blank, and it's called The Strange Thai Insurgents Who Like Sorcery and Getting High on Cough Syrup. All right, first off, can you imagine if this were how a major publication described a Western military operation, like applied to the US or Israel? It would just never happen. But like right out the gate, we are coming in hot with the Orientalism. Let's continue. Kruse Mosque is just outside the city of Patani on the shoulder of Highway 42, so nondescript you could breeze by without noticing. A bullet-riddled sign bears the notation Tourism Authority of Thailand, but nobody coming here is a tourist. Any visitor is told, first with glances, soon in stronger terms, to keep his sojourn brief. Before a cool April dawn in 2004, 100 machete-armed guerrillas launched simultaneous attacks on 11 police and army posts, then took refuge in the mosque. Some were high on a brew of cough syrup, Coca-Cola, and a narcotic plant called Kratom. Some were motorcycle-riding pilgrim bandits, half Haji and half Hell's Angel. Most wore amulets that they believed made them invisible to their enemies, or capable of teleportation, or invulnerable to any type of weaponry. The talismans proved no match for the Thai army's machine guns and rocket-propelled grenades. The blood has been washed from the courtyard stones, but the bullet holes in the sign at the mosque's portal remain defiantly unfilled to this day. Skipping ahead a few paragraphs. Both the government and the rebels commit unspeakable deeds. Live bodies are stacked like cordwood in police vans and emerge hours later as corpses. School teachers and clerks are publicly beheaded. An imam was tortured to death over the course of days, displayed in a makeshift cage. A saffron-robed monk was blown to pieces, an informer was crucified, hands and feet nailed into the street, and soldiers didn't even bother to cast lots for his clothing. Most young men in the Deep South know someone who's been killed, crippled, or arrested. Nearly all have been humiliated by authorities, often on a daily basis. What separates the 10,000 Juaye, the young fighters who form the backbone of this insurgency, from the rest of their angry, alienated peers? A soda bottle, perhaps, and a headband. All right, here we go. I see where we're going. If we're to believe Jonah, young men aren't actually joining the insurgency because they've seen their friends and families and religious leaders brutally murdered by Thai authorities. They're joining the insurgency because they like getting high on kratom and believe in literal witchcraft. Seems plausible. Why don't we continue? The soda bottle contains a narcotic brew based on the kratom. The kratom, I like that. A leaf that grows wild throughout the region. Traditionally, it is taken with tea to mask its bitter taste. Today, the mixer is typically Coca-Cola or sometimes strawberry Fanta. The effect of kratom is similar to that of yaba or methamphetamine, and it has long been popular with construction workers, long-haul truckers, and anyone else with a professional need for periods of hyper-alert insomnia. And here we are, ladies and gentlemen, proof that when it comes to drugs, you can write literally anything and publish it in a major newspaper without any scrutiny. Nobody read this article, paused, and thought, we should double-check this claim that kratom and meth have similar effects. It's not as if millions of people don't use each drugs with policy implications extremely relevant to people knowing what they're talking about. They're not even remotely the same type of drug, for one. Kratom is in the coffee family, and at low doses, its effect is not too different from a cup of coffee. At higher doses, it's like a mild opioid. Nobody is taking kratom to induce hyper-alert insomnia. That is not a thing. I promise you that all of this just came from Jonah's imagination. Let's get back on track. The Juaye do not need to be sleepless and paranoid, so they balance the stimulant of kratom with the depressant of codeine. The beverage they favor was initially called 4x100 with the first numeral representing the number of ingredients, kratom, cough syrup, cola, and a fourth element varying by the brewer's taste, and the second, like so much else in the insurgency, bearing no clear meaning at all. The number of additional ingredients has spiraled, so the cocktail of rebellion is now known as 8x100. The foundation of this cocktail is still kratom, codeine, and soda, but these are supplemented by meth, crushed mosquito coil, tungsten from the inside of light bulbs, and dried bird excrement. Some of the hardest core militants boast of lacing their beverage with ash from a human corpse. Okay, I don't know which BS claim to address first here. Let's start with the fact that cough syrup in Thailand doesn't even contain codeine and hasn't since toxins war on drugs. They literally just have an antihistamine that promotes drowsiness. And if you really think there's a widespread problem of insurgents adding human remains to Kratom cocktails, I have a bridge in Brooklyn to sell you, Jesus Christ. Moving on. Why on earth would anyone drink this? Why would anyone get high on it every day until he has been drained of all capacity for rational thought? Some say it is bravado. Others claim sorcery. Okay, Jonah, who are these people you're talking about? Who says it's bravado? Who says it's sorcery? Are you going to provide names? Otherwise, is any of this real? All right, I'm going to skip the next few paragraphs because it's just him describing the way in which all these militants supposedly believe their magic amulets have supernatural powers that protect them from getting killed. The Insurgency is a tightly controlled, rigidly hierarchical organization structured on classical Maoist guerrilla precepts. Or perhaps it's a completely anarchic, utterly decentralized grassroots movement with no organized command structure whatsoever. In truth, it probably used to be one thing and has morphed into another. Also, in truth, nobody, not the Thai authorities, not Western intelligence services, not the population of the Deep South, and maybe not even the insurgents themselves, actually knows. You know, Jonah's got a good point here. Nobody really knows what's going on in South Thailand. Especially not Jonah. That's the reason he gets paid a 6-figure salary to write word salad about it. Alright, let's hear our friend Jonah try to explain why the insurgency is happening and try to link it to global jihad. Also, remember that this article was written in 2013, and back then everyone was freaking out because Obama wouldn't say the phrase radical Islam, so maybe we can go easy on Jonah because everybody was crazy back then. On the face of it, the rebellion seems to have everything to do with militant Islam. The fighters often call themselves mujahideen, say they're waging jihad, and refer to the Thai as kafir, which means unbelievers. A typical line of graffiti seen in the South reads, "Destruction of infidels and traitors is a religious duty." Occasionally, militants stop a vehicle and force all passengers to recite the Salat. Those unable to do so face a beating, or far worse. Analysts and intelligence officials of several nations scratch their head at the inability of global extremist groups to lure the militants of the Thai South into their family. But the Patani insurgency, in its very aloofness, may offer lessons to anyone seeking an elusive unified theory of jihadism. For the Patani rebels, as for so many others who use religion as a rallying cry, Islam is a symbol more than a set of beliefs. If that weren't the case, how could this uprising be permeated by such thoroughly un-Islamic practices such as sorcery, narco-trafficking, butchery of innocents, and Coca-Cola cannibalism? What does any of this mean? What is Coca-Cola cannibalism? Is he talking about the human remains they supposedly add to the 4x100? Also, again, narco-trafficking? It is pretty well established that these insurgents aren't drug dealers. And the kratom they drink literally grows in their backyard, or well, used to grow in their backyard, before the Thai government started clear-cutting all those forests. Alright, that's the end of our reading series. I mean, no, the article goes on, but I think I'm going to have to stop reading it for the sake of my own sanity. Fortunately, as I mentioned earlier, kratom was decriminalized in 2021. All Thai prisoners locked up for kratom alone have been released, and over 1,000 people got their records expunged immediately. But the battle to legalize kratom and to keep it legal is far from over. In the United States, pain patients and recovering addicts continue to fight against attempts to ban it at a state level, and high-level government officials such as former FDA Commissioner Scott Gottlieb have continued to advocate that it be placed in Schedule 1, the most restrictive level. And when the United States puts a drug in Schedule 1, that creates pressure from countries around the world to regulate and prohibit its use as well, often with devastating consequences. And that's our show today. I hope you enjoyed. If you're interested, follow me on Twitter at DrugCulturesPod. You can always shoot me an email at drugculturespodcast@gmail.com. If you loved it, if you hated it, if you want to be friends, or if you have a topic you'd be interested in learning more about in a future episode, please do not hesitate to reach out. Until next time, take care of yourselves. I'll be back.
you.